Oh boy, here I am talking about Donald Trump yet again. But yet again, I'm doing it because I think there actually is an important lesson to be learned from the tawdry spectacle that is Donald Trump's presidential candidacy. Basically, the further along this whole campaign goes, and the more popular Donald Trump seems to become, the more he rises in the polls, the more I'm convinced that his candidacy proves something that I've suspected for a long time now. It's not just politicians who are full of crap. The ordinary voters whose votes politicians have to win, to whom they have to cater and pander, all too often those voters are full of it too. And for a long time now, I've suspected that the fact that so many voters are full of it is one of the main reasons why so many politicians are full of it, why they have to be full of it in order to get elected and stay elected. What's the recent development in the Trump candidacy that's made me talk this way? Well, it seems that a few weeks ago, the Huffington Post conducted a very interesting poll. They wanted to test the tolerance of both Republicans and Democrats for Donald Trump's ideological apostasies, if you will. He's actually all over the map when it comes to ideology and politics. The man doesn't have a normally functioning ideological compass. He's embraced politicians of both parties over the years. He has embraced policies that both parties have advocated or opposed. He's not really a dyed-in-the-wool through and through conservative, or liberal, for that matter. Well, Huffington Post ran this poll asking the respondents for their levels of support for certain policies depending on which politician it was who was advocating them. They polled people on universal health care, affirmative action, the Iran deal, and Social Security. And they basically described those policies in some questions as having been endorsed by Donald Trump, and in other questions as having been endorsed by liberal Democratic politicians like John Kerry or Barack Obama. Well, guess what they found? When a Democratic politician like John Kerry, for example, talks about the Iran nuclear program deal, most Republicans are opposed to it and most Democrats support it. However, when they describe the same policy as having been supported by Donald Trump rather than by John Kerry or any other liberal Democratic politician, all of a sudden, Republicans' levels of support for the deal rise, and a lot of Democrats' levels of support for the deal fall. For decades now, one of the sort of guiding lights of American conservatism has been this idea that we must stand foursquare against the adoption of single-payer universal health care in America, prevent it from taking shape at all costs. Now, that's been a pretty universal view among conservatives in America for a long time. But guess what? When Republican respondents to this poll were told by the pollsters that Donald Trump supports single-payer health care, support for single-payer health care went from 16% support among Republican respondents to 44%. Think about that. When liberal Democratic politicians were described as the people behind these policies, Republican ordinary voters were generally opposed to the policies. But when Donald Trump, of all people, was described as supporting universal health care, for example, all of a sudden a lot of Republicans are willing to support it just because he said so. What's more, a similar insight is revealed about a lot of Democratic voters. It seems that on that same particular issue, universal health care, when it was stated that Donald Trump supports it, a lot of Democrats, ordinary Democratic voters, stopped supporting it. They were more willing to support it when they were told that Barack Obama advocates that system. But as soon as they were told that Donald Trump advocates it, a lot of their support plummets as well. Their support, if I'm reading this article correctly, went down by 36 points. So when Republican voters are told that Donald Trump supports universal health care, their support rose 28 points. And when Democratic voters were told that, their support for universal health care went down by 36 points. So what does that tell you? Well, what it tells me is that for an awful lot of ordinary people in both parties, politics is not fundamentally about principles. or issues or policies for that matter. All too often, for a great many voters in both parties, it's really at least as much, if not more, about identity politics and personality cults, such as the personality cult that's taken shape around Donald Trump over the past few months. I mean, if you can get 44% of Republican respondents to support a policy like single-payer health care, which is supposed to be anathema to them ideologically, simply because they're told that Donald Trump supports it, that really says something about whether these folks are really driven by any kind of coherent principle at all. Clearly they're not. Now, this wasn't a majority of Republican voters, right? But it was a pretty substantial chunk of them. And much the same was also revealed about Democratic voters, who were a lot less willing to support a policy that's really right up their ideological alley, simply because the wrong politician from the wrong party who makes the wrong noises was described as an advocate of that policy. Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, do you see now why so many politicians are so full of it so much of the time? Why they say one thing and do another? Why they promise certain things and then fail to deliver on those promises? Sometimes they fail even to try to keep those promises at all. Now do you see? Look at whose votes they have to, campaign for. Look at the kinds of people, the kinds of confused people to whom they have to cater in order to get and keep their jobs. No wonder politicians are so disingenuous, dishonest, and hypocritical so much of the time. When the voters, or so many of them at least, across the political spectrum, across the partisan divide, are this disingenuous, or even, again, maybe just really, really confused. And when those voters themselves seem to care so relatively little about principle and policy, what can we really expect from those voters' elected representatives? I don't know. But what I do know is that those of us who do think that principles and policies matter, we've got our work cut out for us. We really have. I think that's one of the major things that Donald Trump's candidacy is revealing to us. It's something that we all need to keep in mind, just how often voters are really not guided by some philosophical pillar of cloud by day and pillar of fire by night. I don't know what else to say. I don't know how else to put it. But boy, those poll results was something else. That's the thing to remember, folks. Sometimes the people are just as full of it as the politicians are.